I am going to be talking a bit about being a neurodivergent researcher while doing research about neurodivergence. And I really wanted to use this space to have, I suppose, kind of prompt some questions and thoughts and talk about some of the sorts of topics that have already been touched upon today, actually in this amazing space. So thank you for organising this, but that we don't really often get to talk about more widely within academia. So just to, let me go forward. There we go. Just to kind of briefly introduce myself, I am Dr. Emma Craddock. I am a senior lecturer in health research at Birmingham City University, and my PhD was in sociology at the University of Nottingham, where I researched activist culture, and particularly looking at anti-austerity activism and women's experiences of activism, cultures and identities, and particularly the sorts of exclusions that exist within those spaces, which also touched upon disability and other intersections. My postdoctoral research has focused on the area of women's health broadly and addressing gendered health inequalities and kind of aiming for improving and increasing social justice. So I've looked at projects around exploring the Women's Health Network in Bradford as a way of engaging with lesser heard voices. I also was a co-investigator on a study exploring period poverty in the UK, and my current research is about women's experiences of late diagnosed autism and ADHD, which is what I'm going to be briefly speaking about today, but I'm not going to be focusing too much on the findings of my research. I can signpost you to papers, and also more than happy to talk about that at length at any point if anyone wants to, but I want to focus more today on the sort of process of being a neurodivergent researcher within academia. I am myself late diagnosed as autistic and ADHD or AuDHD, and also dyspraxic, and that like Chantal mentioned at the start, where her research often comes from her personal experiences. That's the case for myself as well, as essentially once I received my diagnosis, I wanted to find out as much as I could about other women's experiences and found that there was really nothing out there. So I just want to start by reading out an excerpt from an article that I wrote that hopefully kind of sets the scene of my experience and kind of moves into talking about this topic. So I walked into the gym and froze. The kettlebells had been moved. Their colours were in a new order. The cardio equipment had been relocated. Nothing seemed how it was. I felt uneasy and exclaimed to my personal trainer, "Everything's wrong. They're meant to be by the window." This wasn't the first time I'd experienced a visceral reaction to changes in my environment. I once became particularly distressed at the sofa being changed in my counsellor's room. I used to torture myself over why I was like this. Why did I get so upset about things that didn't seem to bother others? I was intelligent and a high achiever despite leaving my work until the last minute and operating on a constant roller coaster of high productive peaks and deeply depressed troughs. Yet the many decisions, steps, and multitasking involved in cooking a meal could send me over the edge. It didn't make sense. I was constantly exhausted. People exhausted me. Life exhausted me. I now know that I'm dyspraxic, autistic, and ADHD. The depression, anxiety, and panic attacks that I struggled with for years were likely burnout and sensory overload. Reading Sarah Hendricks' Women and Girls with Autism Spectrum Disorder was a light bulb moment. She was describing me, my childhood, and my unique weirdness. I couldn't cope with uncertainty and change, however small. The wrong texture of clothes could drive me to losing my temper. I was an extremely bland and fussy eater. I couldn't stand when things were wrong or unjust. I would get fixated on what others could easily let go of. I spent my whole life trying to figure out what others meant when they spoke because they never said what they meant. I would become obsessed with topics and immerse myself, shutting everything else out. Animals were my biggest allies. I couldn't master gears in a car. I was clumsy. I had overwhelming emotional outbursts that I should have grown out of decades ago. I was always late. I lost everything. If I can't see something, it no longer exists. I have multiple copies of things, having forgotten I've already bought them. I feel like I have multiple monkeys in my brain that all need to be kept busy at the same time in order for me to wrestle control over my mind and body. The racing thoughts never stop. When I discovered I was autistic, I suddenly realised it wasn't just me. There wasn't something deeply wrong with me. I wasn't failing at life and unable to cope with the same mundane tasks others breezed through. I experienced the world in a different way. But this wasn't the whole story. I didn't fit neatly into the autistic box. Learning about ADHD explained why I was AuDHD or autistic ADHD. My story is not unique. My research about late diagnosed women's experiences of autism and ADHD shines a light on the rollercoaster lives, misdiagnoses, mental health difficulties, and negative self perceptions of ADHD women who lived a life undiagnosed. So most people here probably already have a good idea of definitions of autism and ADHD, but I'll very briefly touch on it. So autism or autism, what's known as autism spectrum disorder within the diagnostic manual, but is also called autism spectrum condition, which is less deficit-based, is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by a range of challenges in social interaction, communication, and restricted or repetitive behaviors. It's referred to as a spectrum disorder because individuals can vary widely in presentation, and community definitions centre more on what's called spiky profiles of varying impairments that tend to centre the sensory challenges of autism and also the kind of lived experience more than diagnostic criteria does, which is renowned for focusing more on external and socially constructed criteria that is a problem for other people, or rather for neurotypical people. ADHD is characterized by persistent patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that interfere with daily functioning. There are 3 subtypes, including predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, and a combined presentation. Diagnostic criteria, like I said, does vary from community shared definitions and understandings, and it's really important to keep that in mind. I've kind of just included this as a very brief. Here are the official definitions, but there are shared understandings within communities. So autism and ADHD is sometimes referred to as AuDHD, and it's estimated that 30 to 80% of individuals with ADHD are also autistic. Assessments and services are conducted in isolation with no consideration of intersection of conditions or wider intersections of sex, gender, ethnicity, class, age, etc. And a combined diagnosis has only been possible since 2013 because previously they were seen to contradict each other within diagnostic criteria. And I've put here red and blue equals purple because I do really feel that, and for my research as well, that having both autism and ADHD, or being autistic and ADHD, is a distinct experience in itself that isn't just the same as kind of the sum of its parts. There are sex biases in terms of diagnosis. So male, it's been perceived to be male conditions with a higher likelihood of diagnosis in males because of this. Also, the diagnostic criteria exhibits male bias in terms of presentation. There are lots of gender elements in relation to masking behaviours, and others have written about that, and I've written a bit about it as well. But in short, increasing number of women are now gaining awareness and actively pursuing and receiving diagnoses of both conditions. So my research really focused on wanting to understand more about what late diagnosed women's experiences of both autism and ADHD were. We're in the infancy of research exploring women's adulthood diagnoses of autism, and there's even less out there about women's adulthood diagnoses of ADHD. There's an absence of research that considers this experience of both, or of like the purple, the mix of the red and the blue. And my research began to explore that. And what I really wanted to do was make sure, and I resonate with people's comments around issues of ethics, because I initially wanted to do this using data collection via WhatsApp, but I wasn't allowed to, so I ended up doing email interviews, and doing that was really useful for my participants, and they said that they were able to much more I'm demonstrating this right now, they were able to communicate in writing much better than they could verbally, and feel more confident and comfortable doing so. So that kind of links to sort of questions that I've started thinking about in terms of what it's like being a neurodivergent researcher, but also the way that research itself can be seen to be quite neuro-normative, and the sort of things that we expect and think about as what makes good research. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that and kind of open this up for thinking and discussing. So there is some literature out there about being an autistic academic, which highlights some of the challenges and strengths. And along this line of kind of nothing about us without us, the importance of autistic researchers doing research in that area and not being studied ourselves. Some of the kind of, in a nutshell, some of the challenges that I face, which I don't think are spoken about enough, and which produce kind of sometimes can be invisible barriers, are navigating relationships and networking, which is a massive part and important for advancing career and doing research and etc. Knowing when to speak and how to speak. So sometimes I can be left out of conversations or come across in the wrong way. Processing information in different ways. Sorry, it keeps jumping forward. Sensory overload, having different working patterns that I've touched on. Also massive struggles with long-term strategic planning and organizing, which are again things that are really important in terms of progressing. I have a need for structure and clarity. Something that Chantel touched upon earlier that I thought was really interesting and that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of my own personal experience as well, is this before and after time and space, where people often think about the energy expended in, say, social interactions or going to work or everyday things, but also there's a lot in terms of the preparation and the recovery from that, and also potential for others to misunderstand and incorrectly perceive me. So this has led to me thinking more about the sort of ableism of academia, particularly in terms of the expectations for career progression and what sort of quality research supposedly looks like. So things like, if you read any research textbooks, you're always there's a hierarchy where face-to-face research is prioritized. Things like maintaining eye contact and building a good rapport in what is typically quite neurotypical ways are seen as what makes a good researcher. Feminist, smaller scale qualitative research is still not prioritized or valued the same that large scale quantitative research is. And I'm starting to kind of think about how these sorts of implicit rules and sort of field of academia is neuronormative. Similarly, things with career progression, the way that you have to perform and all of the sort of implicit rules and expectations that are there are things that I really find as a barrier, and that I imagine a lot of other neurodivergent individuals find as barriers. And we've touched upon that today, thinking about dyslexia as well and the way that people can interpret what you're presenting. I think the way that I work can be quite different. I think of myself as a bit of an academic magpie, in that I typically research topics that I find interesting, and I know the sort of traditional trajectory for a career is to kind of do a top PhD about something and then continue with that for forever. Whereas I have got strands that run throughout that are I suppose that stay without, but I tend to move around a lot more and get attracted by things that are currently relevant or interesting to me or glittery, and then want to move on to something else. And that can be quite hard to package that up in a way that looks like I've got this well thought out linear career journey and progress, which I've tried to kind of illustrate with this sort of ladder, climbing this ladder of progress and success and what that looks like within academia. Yeah, I don't know how much time I've been talking for. That's another thing that I struggle with is knowing time and limits. But I just thought this was something that I wanted to just really talk about and touch upon in terms of thinking about ourselves as researchers who are maybe neurodivergent or disabled in other ways, and how that can impact, and also not just researchers but academics and that wider context of academia, and how there can be these invisible barriers there. So thank you for listening. And I